July 12, 1943. Early morning near Prokhorovka greets the fighters with an anxious silence. A small village in the Kursk region does not yet know that in a few hours, its name will be inscribed in golden letters in the history of World War II. Here, on a relatively small plot of land, two armored armadas, Soviet and German, are about to clash in a deadly battle. The field near Prokhorovka will become the arena of the greatest tank battle in the history of mankind. 800 Soviet vehicles against 400 German. T-34s against Tigers and Panthers. Russian courage against German technology. This day will become a turning point in the Battle of Kursk. It is here that the fate of Operation Citadel will be decided. The Wehrmacht's last attempt to regain strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. It is here that the offensive potential of the German tank wedges will be finally exhausted. The tank battle near Prokhorovka will turn this land into a real hell of fire, metal, and human courage. After the crushing defeat at Stalingrad in the winter of 1943, Hitler craved revenge. The Wehrmacht had lost the strategic initiative, and the Führer demanded decisive action from his generals, capable of turning the tide of the war on the Eastern Front. Thus was born Operation Citadel, a plan that was supposed to return Germany control over the situation and restore the soldiers' faith in the invincibility of the Third Reich. The Kursk salient, a huge semicircle of the Soviet front line jutting into German positions, looked like an ideal target. The German command developed a classic pincer operation. Powerful tank groups were to strike from the north, from the Orel region, and the south, from the Belgorod region, cutting off the salient at its base. According to the calculations of German strategists, this would allow them to encircle and destroy significant forces of the Red Army, straighten the front line, and create a bridgehead for a further offensive on Moscow. Initially, the operation was planned to begin in May, but Hitler postponed it again and again. He wanted to wait for the arrival of the newest tanks, Tigers and Panthers, on which he placed special hopes. These combat vehicles indeed surpassed Soviet T-34s in firepower and armor protection. The frontal armor thickness of a Tiger reached 100 millimeters, and its 88 millimeter gun could hit Soviet tanks at distances over 2 kilometers, remaining practically invulnerable to their fire. By the beginning of July 1943, the German troop grouping on the Kursk Bulge numbered about 50 divisions, including 17 tank and motorized divisions. In total, this comprised 900,000 personnel, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, 10,000 artillery pieces, and more than 2,000 aircraft. A special role in the Southern Strike Group was played by the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, under the command of Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser. It included the elite divisions Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, staffed with the best crews and the newest equipment. It was this corps that was to be the spearhead of the Southern Wedge, which in a few days would clash with Soviet tanks near Prokhorovka. Long before the start of Operation Citadel, the Soviet military leadership already knew about the German command's plans. This awareness was not accidental. It was the result of the colossal work of intelligence structures, which created one of the most effective information-gathering systems in the history of warfare. The first information about the preparation of a major offensive in the Kursk salient area arrived as early as March 1943. The Red Orchestra intelligence network, operating in the highest echelons of the Third Reich, transmitted information to Moscow about the development of an operation codenamed Citadel. Agents reported on the concentration of tank divisions, the movement of reserves, and even the timing of the planned offensive. In parallel, British intelligence, which had deciphered German radio messages by breaking the Enigma code, transmitted data to the Soviet command about the movements of German troops, and the content of directives from the Wehrmacht's High Command. Churchill personally authorized the transfer of these top-secret materials to the Soviet ally. Frontline intelligence also made a huge contribution. Reconnaissance groups operating behind enemy lines recorded the arrival of echelons with equipment, captured tongues from among German officers, and gathered data on the location of firing points and minefields. Aerial reconnaissance conducted daily photographic surveys of enemy positions, noting the slightest changes in troop deployment. By June 1943, the Stavka of the Supreme High Command possessed not only the general plan of the German offensive, but also detailed information about the composition of the strike groups, the directions of the main attacks, and even the approximate timing of the operation's start. It was this unprecedented awareness that allowed Stalin to make a strategic decision that changed the course of the war. To switch to a deliberate defense. Instead of preempting the German offensive, the Soviet command decided to allow the enemy to exhaust their forces in an offensive against a deeply echeloned defense, and then deliver a crushing counterattack. An unprecedented system of defensive lines, up to 300 kilometers deep, was created on the Kursk salient. 8 defensive zones included 25,000 kilometers of trenches, 400,000 mines, and thousands of anti-tank areas. Simultaneously, strategic reserves for the counteroffensive were accumulated in the rear, including the 5th Guards Tank Army, under the command of General Rotmistrov. By July 12, 1943, 2 powerful armored groupings, ready to decide the outcome of the battle for the Kursk Bulge, were concentrated on a small plot of land near Prokhorovka. The Soviet side was represented by the 5th Guards Tank Army under the command of Lieutenant General Pavel Alexeyevich Rotmistrov, a career military officer who had risen from platoon commander to army commander. His army numbered approximately 800 tanks and self-propelled artillery mounts. The core of the Soviet armored forces consisted of the legendary T-34s, medium tanks that had earned a reputation as reliable and maneuverable combat vehicles. These 32-ton steel behemoths were armed with 76mm cannons, capable of penetrating the armor of most German tanks at a range of up to 1 kilometer. The armored vehicle fleet was supplemented by light T-70 tanks with 45mm guns and various self-propelled artillery mounts. The German side was represented by the 2 SS Panzer Corps, an elite formation that included the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions. Under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser were approximately 400 armored vehicles. Although the German grouping was numerically inferior to the Soviet one, the qualitative composition of its equipment commanded respect. The pride of the German tank forces were the heavy Tiger tanks, weighing 57 tons, with 88mm guns capable of engaging Soviet tanks at ranges beyond the reach of return fire. They were supplemented by the newest Panthers, medium tanks with powerful 75mm cannons, and modernized PZKP-FW-5Es with long-barreled 75mm guns. The balance of forces was not in favor of the Germans in terms of vehicle numbers, approximately 2-to-1 in favor of the Soviet side. However, the qualitative superiority of German equipment was undeniable. Tigers and Panthers had more powerful guns, allowing them to engage Soviet tanks at distances of up to 2 kilometers, while T-34s could effectively combat German heavy tanks only at ranges of less than 500 meters. German crews also surpassed Soviet tank crews in combat experience. Many drivers, gunners, and tank commanders of the SS Corps had years of combat experience, not only on the Eastern Front, but also in Western Europe. Soviet tank units, although they included veterans, were largely staffed by young soldiers who had undergone accelerated training. Prokhorovka met the tank crews of both armies, not with a flat field for a classic tank battle, but with complex terrain that itself became a participant in the battle. The hilly area, dissected by ravines and gullies, created natural obstacles for maneuvering heavy equipment. This land seemed to resist the bloody spectacle that was about to unfold on its surface. The Psel River, narrow but with marshy banks, divided the combat zone into two unequal parts. Its winding course created a natural barrier for tank formations, limiting the possibilities for broad maneuver. Forcing the river for heavy German tanks presented a serious problem. Tigers, weighing 57 tons, risked getting stuck in the soft soil of the coastal zone. The railway embankment, crossing the field of the future battle, also played an important tactical role. Up to 4 meters high, it created an artificial line that could be used both for defense and for the covert deployment of equipment. The Soviet command took this terrain feature into account when planning the counterattack. The dominant height of the area was 252.2 meters, named Krutoy Log. Whoever controlled this height gained a strategic advantage, the ability to view a significant part of the battlefield and adjust artillery fire. The struggle for this key point became one of the decisive episodes of the entire battle. A peculiarity of the Prokhorovka landscape was that it neutralized the main advantage of German tank forces, the ability to conduct aimed fire at long distances. Constant folds in the terrain, ravines and gullies reduced the direct line of sight to 500 to 700 meters, and in some places to 200 to 300. At such distances, even light Soviet tanks could effectively hit the side armor of German heavy vehicles. Dust and smoke from shell explosions rising above the battlefield further reduced visibility, turning the battle into a chaotic, close-range melee. In such conditions, the tactics of German tank aces, accustomed to destroying the enemy from a safe distance, proved largely ineffective. The hilly terrain also complicated the coordination of large tank formations. Commanders could not see the entire picture of the battle, and often made decisions based on limited information received by radio from individual crews. This led to the battle breaking down into many local clashes, where the outcome depended on the skill and determination of individual crews. All these geographical features turned the Prokhorovka field into an ideal arena for a close-quarters, wall-to-wall tank battle, where the decisive factors were not the technical characteristics of the machines, but the courage and skill of the crews. The terrain seemed to have been specially created to neutralize the technical superiority of German tank forces and give Soviet tank crews a chance to demonstrate their bravery and combat skill. July 12, 1943, 8:30 in the morning. Over the Prokhorovka field rolled the thunder of an artillery barrage. The short but powerful fire strike of Soviet guns became the signal for the beginning of the greatest tank battle in the history of mankind. Immediately after the artillery raid, hundreds of Soviet tanks of General Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army moved forward. T-34s, lined up in several echelons, gained speed, raising clouds of dust. Rotmistrov's plan was simple and daring: to crush the German lines with a sudden, powerful blow, preventing the enemy from deploying into battle formation. "Forward, at full speed without stopping!" Such was the commander's order. The tank crews understood. Only a swift assault could compensate for the technical superiority of German machines. Simultaneously with the Soviet tanks, IL-2 attack aircraft went into the attack. Red-starred, flying tanks at treetop level rushed towards German positions, showering them with fire from cannons and rockets. But the German command was also preparing for an offensive. At almost the same time, the tank columns of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps began to advance towards Soviet troops. Tigers and Panthers of the Leibstandarte, Reich, and Totenkopf divisions moved towards Prokhorovka, unaware of the scale of the confrontation awaiting them. Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser was confident of success. His tank crews had experience, technology, and morale. German intelligence reported only minor Soviet forces in the Prokhorovka area. Information about the concentration of an entire tank army remained unknown to the Germans. Over the battlefield, smoke from shell explosions and burning equipment quickly thickened. It was mixed with clouds of dust raised by the tracks of hundreds of tanks. Visibility rapidly decreased. Within half an hour after the start of the battle, it was reduced to several hundred meters. In this smoky hell, coordination of actions became almost impossible. Radio communication worked intermittently. Commanders lost control over units. The battle broke down into dozens of local skirmishes, where the skill and courage of individual crews decided the fate. Around 10 in the morning, what both sides had been anticipating and simultaneously dreading occurred. A head-on collision of tank armadas. On a narrow 5-kilometer-wide stretch, hundreds of combat vehicles converged in a deadly struggle. The formation of Soviet T-34s at full speed crashed into the battle lines of German tanks. The earth trembled from the impact of thousands of tons of metal. The air filled with the roar of engines and the clang of tracks. The combat distance instantly shrank to a minimum, 200 to 300 meters, and sometimes even less. In some places, enemy tanks literally touched sides. German vehicles found themselves in a situation for which they were unprepared. Their main advantage, the ability to engage Soviet tanks from long distances, evaporated overnight. The long-barreled guns of the Tigers, designed for firing from 2 kilometers, proved almost useless in this melee. Tank crews barely had time to aim their guns when enemy vehicles were already on their flanks. At such distances, even light Soviet T-70s could penetrate the side armor of heavy German tanks. The battle turned into a chaotic struggle where each crew acted practically independently. Tanks maneuvered between burning vehicles, firing on the move, literally at point-blank range. In this steel maelstrom, there was no time for aiming. Shots were fired intuitively, often blindly. Soviet tank crews, following Rotmistrov's order, sought to close with the enemy as much as possible. Some crews, having exhausted their ammunition or lost the ability to fire due to damage, resorted to ramming. Driver mechanics steered their vehicles into German tanks, aiming to strike the side or tracks. Even an immobilized T-34 could continue the fight, turning into a stationary strongpoint. German tank crews, accustomed to methodical long-range combat, were psychologically unprepared for such an onslaught. Their tactical schemes crumbled within the first minutes of contact. Interaction between crews broke down, each vehicle becoming a separate combat unit, forced to independently find a way out of a critical situation. German tank commanders desperately tried to restore order in their units, but the roar of battle drowned out radio communications. In the center of this fiery whirlpool were the elite crews of the Leibstandarte division. Their Tigers, despite their powerful armor, became vulnerable when Soviet tanks attacked from the flanks and rear. No tank, not even the most advanced, could withstand shells hitting its side from a distance of several tens of meters. The battlefield quickly filled with burning vehicles from both sides. Black columns of smoke rose to the sky, further worsening visibility. Tank crews oriented themselves by flashes of gunfire and silhouettes of vehicles flickering in the smoke. Sometimes Soviet tanks mistakenly opened fire on their own, and German tanks on theirs. In this chaos, those who made decisions faster, shot more accurately, and maneuvered their vehicles more skillfully, survived. By noon, the battle reached its climax. On an area of several square kilometers, dozens of tanks burned simultaneously. Crews of knocked-out vehicles, if they managed to escape, continued the fight on foot, using personal weapons. Some tank crews moved to other vehicles, replacing fallen comrades. This was not just a battle of technology. It was a confrontation of will and spirit. General Rotmistrov's decision for a frontal tank attack became one of the most controversial tactical moves of the Battle of Kursk. Even decades later, military historians continue to debate the expediency of this step. The swift dash of Soviet tanks towards German Tigers and Panthers led to colossal losses. Hundreds of vehicles were destroyed in a few hours of battle. Crews perished, not even having time to evacuate from their crippled machines. The cost of this decision was measured in thousands of human lives and hundreds of units of precious equipment. However, there is another side to the coin. The frontal attack deprived German tanks of their main advantage, the ability to methodically shell Soviet vehicles from a safe distance. In the chaos of close combat, the technological superiority of the Tigers, with their powerful guns and thick armor, was largely negated. Many German tank crews later recalled that they had never encountered such a fierce attack and were not prepared for it, either tactically or psychologically. According to Rotmistrov himself, he made the decision for a frontal assault, understanding that any delay would allow the Germans to organize a deeply echeloned defense and methodically destroy Soviet tanks. He preferred a quick and bloody operation to a protracted and possibly even bloodier battle. Many modern military analysts believe that, given the specific conditions of July 12, 1943, this decision, despite its high cost, was optimal. No less controversial was Obergruppenführer SS Paul Hauser's decision to divide his forces into several directions. Instead of concentrating all his tanks for a breakthrough on one narrow sector, the German commander dispersed his forces, which significantly weakened the striking power of each group. This allowed Soviet troops to defeat the enemy piecemeal, preventing him from creating a decisive advantage in any single direction. Hauser, an experienced officer with campaigns in Poland, France, and on the Eastern Front under his belt, made a classic mistake. He underestimated the enemy's strength. German intelligence failed to detect the concentration of the 5th Guards tank army in time, and the SS Corps commander acted blindly, relying on outdated information about the enemy. The Battle of Prokhorovka clearly demonstrated how important in military affairs are not only the technical characteristics of weaponry, but also the tactical skill of commanders, their ability to make decisions in critical situations. German tanks, superior to Soviet ones in many parameters, could not realize their advantage due to tactical miscalculations by the command. The Prokhorovka field became an arena not only for the clash of steel machines, but also of the human spirit. Behind every tank stood a crew, people of flesh and blood whose courage sometimes surpassed the capabilities of technology. It was their bravery and self-sacrifice that determined the outcome of this grandiose battle. On the outskirts of a small grove, a Soviet T-34 under the command of Lieutenant Alexander Spiller engaged in an unequal fight with a group of German tanks. With the very first shot, an enemy shell damaged the running gear, depriving the machine of mobility. But the crew did not abandon the disabled tank. Turning it into an immobile firing point, the tankers continued to fight. "As long as we're alive, we'll fight." These words of Spiller became the crew's motto. In the next 40 minutes, they destroyed 7 German tanks, including 2 heavy Tigers. Only when the tank ran out of ammunition and Spiller himself was severely wounded did the crew abandon the burning machine, carrying their commander with them. Near a railway embankment, another drama unfolded. Lieutenant Nikolai Shalandin's tank was hit and caught fire. The driver-mechanic suffered severe burns but continued to control the machine. Seeing that the tank was doomed, Shalandin made a decision that became a symbol of the self-sacrifice of Soviet tankers. He aimed the burning machine at a German Panther that was preparing to open fire on a column of Soviet tanks. "Farewell, comrades," Shalandin managed to shout into the radio a second before the collision. A powerful explosion destroyed both tanks. At the cost of their own lives, the crew saved dozens of their comrades. German tankers also showed extraordinary courage. SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, commander of a company of heavy tanks of the Leibstandarte Division, found himself at the epicenter of a Soviet attack. His Tiger was surrounded by several T-34s. Coolly maneuvering and accurately firing, Whitman destroyed 8 Soviet tanks before a shell damaged the track of his machine. Even with his tank immobilized, Whitman continued the fight until he ran out of ammunition. Only then, under the cover of a smokescreen, did the crew abandon the machine and break through to their positions. At height 252.2, driver-mechanic Sergeant Mikhail Bukhtuev performed a feat that saved the lives of dozens of infantrymen. Noticing a German machine gun pinning down Soviet infantry, he directed his tank at the firing point. A burst of machine gun fire ended the hero's life, but his tank continued to move and crushed the machine gun along with its crew. On this day, so many feats were performed on the Prokhorovka field that it is impossible to list them all. Every surviving tanker could tell more than one story of the heroism of comrades. Behind the statistics of losses and victories stood thousands of fates of people who displayed the highest degree of courage and self-sacrifice. While a grandiose tank battle unfolded on the ground, an equally fierce battle raged in the sky above Prokhorovka. The airspace became an arena of deadly confrontation, where the fate of the ground operation was decided. Whoever controlled the sky gained an enormous advantage in the tank battle. From early morning on July 12th, Soviet Il-2 attack aircraft took to the air from frontline airfields. These armored machines, dubbed Black Death by the Germans, were designed specifically to destroy tanks. Their armored bathtub protected the pilot and engine from anti-aircraft fire, while 37mm cannons and rockets turned the Il-2 into a formidable weapon against armored vehicles. The first wave of 48 attack aircraft, under the cover of Yak-9 fighters, surged towards a concentration of German tanks. Approaching their targets at an altitude of only 50 to 100 meters, Soviet pilots opened fire with all their weapons. Armor-piercing shells penetrated the thin top armor of German tanks, while rockets struck concentrations of infantry and artillery. The German command, understanding the importance of air support, threw its best aviation units into battle. Juncker's Ju-87 dive bombers, the famous Stukas, with their characteristic siren wail, dove onto Soviet tank columns. Their 200-kilogram bombs flung fountains of earth and metal into the air, leaving behind twisted tank carcasses. Fierce dogfights broke out in the air between Soviet and German fighters. Yaks and Lavochkins engaged Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Aerial duels unfolded at all altitudes, from treetop level to 4,000 meters. Pilots used their full arsenal of maneuvers, turns, climbs, dives, striving to get on the enemy's tail and open fire with machine guns and cannons. Soviet ace Alexander Pokrishkin shot down 3 German aircraft that day, bringing his personal tally to 30 victories. His famous formula, altitude, speed, maneuver, fire, allowed him to emerge victorious from the most complex aerial engagements. By noon, a turning point occurred in the sky over Prokhorovka. The massive actions of Soviet aviation began to yield results. German bombers, deprived of reliable fighter cover, became easy prey for Soviet pilots. Many of them, failing to reach their targets, were forced to jettison their bombs haphazardly and hastily return to base. For the first time since the beginning of the Battle of Kursk, Soviet aviation managed to gain temporary air superiority in a key sector of the front. This allowed Il-2 attack aircraft to operate virtually with impunity, striking German tank columns and artillery positions. By the evening of July 12th, Soviet pilots had made over 300 combat sorties in the Prokhorovka area. German aviation, despite desperate resistance, could not provide reliable cover for its ground forces. This victory in the air became one of the key factors that determined the outcome of the ground battle. By the evening of July 12, 1943, the field near Prokhorovka presented an apocalyptic scene. Hundreds of burning tanks from both sides had transformed the once peaceful hills into a hellish landscape, reminiscent of Bosch's paintings. Black smoke from the destroyed machinery rose to the sky, obscuring the sun and creating an ominous twilight over the battlefield. The ground was literally plowed by tracks and shells, and the air was thick with the heavy smell of burnt metal, gunpowder, and diesel. Surviving tank crews, infantrymen, and medics wandered through this chaos, trying to rescue wounded comrades and assess the scale of what had happened. The exact losses of both sides in this grandiose battle still remain a subject of fierce debate among historians. According to modern, most objective estimates, the Soviet side lost about 300 tanks and self-propelled artillery units. German losses were less, approximately 100 units of armored vehicles. However, behind this dry statistic lies a much more complex and ambiguous picture. Soviet tanks, mainly T-34s, could be relatively quickly repaired and returned to service. Many vehicles, listed as destroyed, re-entered battle after a few days or weeks. German losses, on the other hand, often proved irreparable. The complex design of Tigers and Panthers made their field repair practically impossible. Moreover, German industry, experiencing increasing difficulties, could not provide quick replacements for lost equipment. No less important was the human factor. The German SS Panzer Corps lost dozens of its most experienced crews that day. Tankers who had fought through Poland, France, and 2 years of war on the Eastern Front. Replacing such specialists was virtually impossible. Soviet tank units, despite heavy losses, could count on reinforcements from training centers, where thousands of young tankers underwent accelerated training. But the main point was that the strategic goal of the Soviet command was fully achieved. The offensive potential of the SS Panzer Corps, the main striking force of the southern face of the Kursk salient, was exhausted. The German advance was halted. Subsequent attempts to resume the offensive yielded no results. The enemy simply lacked the strength for a decisive thrust. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding the southern grouping of German forces, was forced to admit that Operation Citadel had reached a dead end. His panzer divisions, initially intended for a deep breakthrough and encirclement of Soviet troops, got bogged down in defensive battles, losing their last reserves. For Adolf Hitler, the failure of the offensive was a severe blow. The Führer had placed enormous hopes on Operation Citadel, counting not only on military success, but also on a psychological effect. The Wehrmacht was supposed to prove that even after Stalingrad, it was capable of delivering crushing blows. Now these hopes collapsed, and the German command was forced to switch to strategic defense on the entire Eastern Front. The Soviet Stavka of the Supreme High Command, having received information about the results of the Prokhorovka battle, immediately began preparations for a large-scale counteroffensive. Operations Kutuzov and Rumyantsev, developed in advance, were to turn a defensive victory into an offensive triumph. For the German troops, a long and painful path to the west began, a path that 2 years later would lead them to complete defeat and unconditional surrender. In the decades since the Battle of Kursk, a whole mythology has formed around the Battle of Prokhorovka. Some of these myths have taken such deep root that they have come to be perceived as undeniable facts. However, modern research, based on declassified archives from both sides, allows for a more objective look at these events. The first and most common myth concerns the scale of the battle. The figure of 1,200 tanks, supposedly simultaneously clashing on the battlefield, appeared in post-war Soviet sources and firmly entered historiography. In reality, the total number of armored vehicles participating in the battle on July 12th was less, about 800 Soviet and 400 German machines. Moreover, not all of them participated in the battle simultaneously. But even these clarified figures do not diminish the scale of the event. Prokhorovka remains the largest tank battle in history, where an unprecedented number of armored vehicles were concentrated on a relatively small section of the front. Another persistent myth is associated with the massive ramming attacks by Soviet tank crews. Post-war memoirs and artistic works often described episodes where dozens of T-34s deliberately rammed German heavy tanks. The reality was different. Ramming incidents did indeed occur, but they were isolated acts of heroism by individual crews, not a mass tactic. Nor is the myth of the complete rout of German tank units true. The Soviet side suffered heavier losses in equipment in this battle than the enemy. However, the strategic victory remained with the Red Army. The offensive potential of the German grouping was exhausted, and Operation Citadel reached a dead end. For a long time, the role of the new German tanks, Tigers and Panthers, was also exaggerated. According to post-war Soviet sources, hundreds of these machines operated at Prokhorovka. Documents from German archives show that in reality, there were only a few dozen of them, and not all were in working order. Modern research also adjusts the assessment of tactical command decisions. Rotmistrov's frontal attack, long considered a model of military leadership, is now evaluated more critically. Despite its decisiveness, it led to unjustifiably high losses. At the same time, the German command's decision to disperse forces in several directions is recognized as a serious mistake. But the most important thing that new research reveals to us is the human dimension of the battle. Behind the dry figures of losses and victories stand thousands of fates of specific individuals who showed the highest degree of courage and self-sacrifice. Their exploits do not need mythologizing. The real events of the Battle of Prokhorovka are dramatic and majestic enough on their own. The Battle of Prokhorovka became a true turning point not only for the Battle of Kursk, but for the entire war on the Eastern Front. Although from a purely tactical perspective, it is difficult to unequivocally call it a victory for Soviet troops, strategically it fulfilled its main task. It halted the advance of the German strike force and completely exhausted their offensive potential. July 12, 1943, can be considered the day when Operation Citadel effectively failed. The SS Panzer Corps, the main striking force of the southern face of the German offensive, lost its capacity for active offensive operations. Despite relatively small losses in equipment, German tank units lost many experienced crews, and their vehicles required serious repairs that could not be carried out in the field. After the Battle of Prokhorovka, the German command finally lost strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. Field Marshal Manstein still tried to convince Hitler to continue the offensive, but the Führer already understood the futility of these attempts. On July 17th, just 5 days after the tank battle, Hitler ordered the cessation of Operation Citadel. The situation for the German command was aggravated by events on other fronts. On July 10, 1943, Anglo-American forces landed in Sicily, opening a new front in the Mediterranean. This required the immediate transfer of some forces from the Eastern Front. Just a week after the Battle of Prokhorovka, the SS division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler received orders to redeploy to Italy. Thus, Prokhorovka did not merely halt the German offensive. It bought precious time for the preparation of the Soviet counteroffensive. Operations Kutuzov and Rumyantsev, developed by the Stavka of the Supreme High Command, started on August 12th and 3rd respectively, completing the rout of German forces on the Kursk Bulge. The strategic significance of the Battle of Prokhorovka extends far beyond a local engagement. It marked the final transfer of initiative to Soviet troops. After the Battle of Kursk, the Wehrmacht would never again be able to conduct large-scale offensive operations on the Eastern Front. From now on, German troops would only retreat, slowly and with fierce fighting, but steadily to the west. The Battle of Prokhorovka changed not only the course of the Battle of Kursk, but also the entire philosophy of employing tank formations. The bloody experience of July 12, 1943, forced military strategists of both opposing sides to revise established tactical schemes and develop new approaches to tank warfare. The Soviet command drew a crucial lesson from Prokhorovka. Even a quantitative superiority in tanks does not guarantee success without carefully organized interaction with other branches of service. After this battle, the Red Army began forming mixed composition tank armies, where tank corps were reinforced by mechanized formations with motorized infantry, self-propelled artillery, and anti-aircraft assets. Marshal of Armored Forces Rotmistrov, who commanded the 5th Guards Tank Army at Prokhorovka, later wrote, "Tanks are not a universal weapon. Without the support of infantry, artillery, and aviation, even the most advanced combat vehicles turn into metal coffins for their crews." The German command also came to similar conclusions. Even such advanced machines as Tigers and Panthers proved vulnerable in close combat without proper infantry support. After Prokhorovka, the Germans began forming battle groups, Kampfgruppen, which included tanks, infantry, artillery, and sappers in a single tactical formation. The issue of air superiority became particularly important. The experience of Prokhorovka showed that even the technological superiority of tanks is nullified in the absence of reliable air cover. Soviet Il-2 attack aircraft, operating over the battlefield, inflicted no less damage on German tank units than ground forces. After July 12, 1943, both warring sides began to avoid large-scale, wall-to-wall tank battles. Frontal attacks were replaced by more complex tactical schemes involving flanking maneuvers, envelopments, and the creation of mobile anti-tank areas. Tank wedges, so popular at the beginning of the war, gave way to more flexible formations, with echeloning of forces and assets in depth. Prokhorovka became the last example of a classic tank battle, and, at the same time, the first step towards the modern concept of combined arms combat, where tanks are just one element of a complex system of interaction between different branches of service. This evolution of tank tactics saved thousands of lives of tank crews in subsequent battles of World War II, and formed the basis of post-war concepts for the employment of armored forces. Today, the majestic memorial complex Prokhorovka Field rises at the site of the legendary battle. The snow-white belfry, 59 meters high, 1 meter for each week the war lasted, is visible for dozens of kilometers. Every hour, the bell chimes, reminding the living of the fallen's feet. Here, where once the earth burned and metal melted, now reigns a solemn silence, broken only by the rustling of grass and the ringing of bells. Prokhorovka Field has rightfully become Russia's third battlefield, after Kulikovo and Borodino. This land, soaked in blood and soot, has turned into a symbol of an unyielding spirit and military valor. Thousands of people come here, from gray-haired veterans to schoolchildren, to touch living history, to feel the breath of those heroic and terrible days. The museum carefully preserves evidence of the tank inferno, charred fragments of combat vehicles, personal belongings of tank crews, letters that never reached their addressees, photographs of heroes. Each exhibit is a silent witness to the feat accomplished on this land in the summer of '43. The historical significance of the Battle of Prokhorovka extends far beyond a local clash. This day became a symbolic point of no return for the German war machine. It was here, in the smoke and flame of the tank battle, that Hitler's hopes for victory in the war finally vanished. The strategic initiative, lost by the Wehrmacht after Stalingrad, now irrevocably passed to the Red Army. Prokhorovka marked the beginning of the long road to Berlin, a road that would take almost 2 more years of the hardest fighting, but whose outcome was predetermined precisely here, on the sun-scorched and fire-scorched Kursk land. From Prokhorovka to the Reichstag, there were 2,000 kilometers and 22 months of war. But the first step was taken right here, The tactical lessons of this battle are still studied in military academies around the world. Prokhorovka forever changed the understanding of tank warfare, demonstrating that even the most perfect equipment is powerless against the human spirit and sound strategy. This experience formed the basis of post-war concepts for the use of armored forces and combined arms combat.